Well, the Copenhagen clock is ticking. 26 days left until the big climate treaty meeting begins in Denmark. 37 days until it ends. A lot of observers say that is not time enough to resolve the big issues blocking a new treaty, but not Massachusetts Congressman Ed Markey. Margaret Ryan is here with more about Congressman Markey. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Susan. Well, Markey says, remember, all the experts said the House couldn't pass the climate bill this year before the Memorial Day recess, but it did. So Markey thinks the 5 weeks left before push comes to shove in Copenhagen is plenty of time for unexpected breakthroughs that could lead to substantive agreements, if not a full treaty in Copenhagen. He told reporters today that with a final meeting of the 2-year treaty process closing in, the urgency for action has become real. Serious offers are finally being put on the table. And Markey says the first place to watch for breakthroughs is Beijing, next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. That's when President Obama meets President Hu Jintao for a series of bilateral discussions with climate change high on the agenda. Now, Markey said he expects to visit to illuminate the U.S. climate negotiating position in a significant way. And he says he sees the talks as key in Obama's decision whether to go personally to Copenhagen.
That is the big question, I guess, is whether the president will go. But hasn't the White House really been playing down the climate change part of this trip to Beijing?
Yes, indeed they have. Markey was much more upbeat from what we've heard than what we've heard from the White House. Todd Stern, the chief climate negotiator last week, kind of lowered expectations, saying there would be no deal expected. And senior officials, White House officials speaking just yesterday, told reporters they don't expect a climate change agreement from Beijing. Michael Froman, who's Deputy National Security Advisor, said the two leaders are going to discuss how best to proceed. Those are his words, and he would, in order to make Copenhagen a success. But he did say negotiations are still ongoing, so perhaps there's some indication there could be some further development. Markey just told the symposium he was very upbeat. He said he expected a very good, positive result. Those are his words of the meeting. He sees the U.S. and China recognizing that they have a partnership in saving the climate.
Any idea whether the Chinese share that view?
Well, Markey told of working with his Chinese counterpart, the legislator who chairs an environment committee in the Chinese legislature, and at some international legislators forum, and said they were able to agree on principles. He says the Chinese are very up to date on what the U.S. is doing, and he thinks that it's perfectly possible that we can come together. Now, there was some polite sparring today between Markey and Sun Guoshun. He's the first secretary of the Chinese embassy here in D.C. He was another speaker today. And Sun challenged the U.S. using peak emissions year of 2005 instead of 1990 as the year from which it's going to cut. He said to Markey, basically, he said very politely, your bill will only cut those emissions by about 3% instead of the 25 to 40% science says is needed. And how are you going to close this gap? Markey said, look, his bill should be recognized as really aggressive action. He said the world has to recognize how far the U.S. has come in only 10 months. He said, sure, we were laggards. We started way back, but we're really working on it now. And he said, and I was fascinated by this quote, the U.S. has hidden behind China for a generation, and China has hidden behind the U.S. He said, we can't do it any longer. We have to get past history. The U.S. and China should be partners. He said, while the bulk of historic emissions come from industrialized countries, 97% of the expected growth in emissions up to 2050 is going to come from the emerging economies. Right. So he said, neither of us can do it alone.
Right. Okay. Well, what a comment. That is really something. So what about prospects for climate legislation in the Senate?
Well, Markey cited particularly Senator Baucus, the story you just reported, the comments that, he's committed to passing strong climate legislation. He said all the signs are that sometime in the coming year, the Senate will get it through. He did not think before Copenhagen. His view was that there is no substantial international agreement possible without domestic legislation. He said a problem in the past is that energy and climate legislation have been viewed as separate. And he said now we're finally bringing them together and recognizing that they really do go together. His view, he said, forget the deniers or the skeptics. Climate legislation is inevitable. The only choice is the easy way or the hard way. He said you can do it the easy way, pass my bill, or you can do it the hard way, let EPA regulate.
Wow. And Markey does not think a full treaty is possible, though.
No speaker today did. We had heard one interesting take from Frank Loy, who's held multiple roles at the State Department. He said getting 67 votes for anything in the Senate now is going to be impossible. There was a former Bush administration official who disputed that, but he said, no, it may be better to get something short of a treaty so you do not need ratification. He said, this is being discussed as we speak. Does it make sense for the U.S. to aim for something short of a full treaty?
Okay, so even more evidence of everything, generally the conclusion that we reported on from Spain.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right, Margaret Ryan, thank you.